What's up, everybody? Welcome into the CSN studio. Sebastian Salazar here with you for this edition of Real Fantasy. And you know the drill by now. We're going to hit daily, season long. We got contributors from across the country lined up to help. And listen, we're heading into week 7, so don't look now. But the fantasy season is at its halfway point. If you are not above the playoff line just yet, now is the time to make your move. And to that end, we have just the people to get you over the fantasy hump. She joins us every week from the NFL Network. Kay Adams on Twitter at HeyKayAdams, and Josh Norris also on Twitter at Josh Norris. Follow his work for both NBC Sports and Roto World. Guys, let's get right to it. Our quick hits, and no news bigger out of week 6 than the injury to Ben Roethlisberger, out 4 to 6 weeks after injuring his knee and then having surgery. Since Big Ben entered the league, Steelers are just 12-9 without him as their starter, and their offense averages almost 10 points a game less without number 7 under center. But newsflash, we don't care how the Steelers do. We care about how your fantasy team does. And guys, fantasy owners should be nervous right now. Here's a great example why. Le'Veon Bell was the most expensive running back on FanDuel each of the last 3 weeks. This week, no Big Ben. He's already dropped to 3rd on that list. Josh, the writing is on the wall. Pittsburgh could really struggle without Roethlisberger. But who on this Steelers offense is going to take the biggest hit?
Well, I think the entire offense, number one, because they'll score 6 fewer points on average without Big Ben, 100 fewer yards on average. Let's take it from the perspective of Le'Veon Bell. With Ben Roethlisberger, this team runs the football on 33% of their snaps. Without him, 51%. So theoretically, this gives you more volume and hopefully efficiency on top of that with Le'Veon Bell. So maybe we'll see more yards, more targets, more carries. But I'll say this, the ceiling K is capped here for Le'Veon Bell in terms of his fantasy output. I don't think we'll see 30-point weeks, 25-point weeks from Le'Veon Bell at all.
I think they're going to lean on the run, like you're saying. I still am very confident starting Le'Veon Bell, and I'm not avoiding him in fantasy. Unfortunately, we've seen this before. We saw 4 games without Big Ben. He's missed 20 games in his career. But with his current offense last year, in those 4 games, the biggest knock's going to be Antonio Brown, who's never had 10 targets in a single game without Big Ben. He's never had a touchdown. He's never caught a touchdown, Josh, from any other quarterback but his boy, Big Ben. He averaged 4 catches for under 60 yards without his boy, Big Ben, last year. So if you get 80 yards and no score, that's what you should be happy and know what you're getting, given the track record.
We mentioned earlier in the show, we're headed towards mid-season, and it might be time to press the panic button on several players. Is Jamal Charles no more than the backup now in Kansas City? Or what about a guy like Todd Gurley? He still can't get going for the Rams. And in New York, Matt Forte and the entire Jets offense has struggled, and not sure how trustworthy any of them are right now with Geno Smith taking over. Okay, guys, so time to turn that panic meter all the way up to 11. Kay, we're going to start with you. Who are you done with and why?
It's Ryan Matthews, and I've told you I'm the biggest broken record in the business on Ryan Matthews. We keep trying to make him happen. I've never drafted him, never a good bet to stay healthy. He's not even out there on all the snaps. You take him because you think, oh, he's going to be the feature guy. This backfield is a mess with Wendell Smallwood, Kenyon Barner, Darren Sproles. Last week, Ryan Matthews played on 21% of snaps. That boggles my mind and does not make me confident in playing him going forward.
Okay, just a few weeks ago, you referred to Marvin Jones as Marvitron. I own him in almost every single league. I'm honestly a bit worried. Over the last 4 weeks, only 26 targets after having 21 targets in the first 2 weeks. Look, I'm not saying you bench Marvin Jones, but I'm saying if you have some better options, he's worth considering. And he's not the wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 numbers that he's been putting up in those first few weeks. Now he's mainly only getting 4 receptions per game on average, and the touchdowns are saving him, especially last week. And against the Washington Redskins this week, I think it's a much more difficult matchup than people are taking credit for. I think Marvin Jones will struggle again this week and continue on this downward trend so far.
All right, guys, there was a lot of panic around Jay Ajayi when he was benched week 1 because he spent practice time sulking. He struggled to find playing time back in September, but then come October, he's really started to emerge, and he went off last week against the Steelers to the tune of 204 yards and a couple of scores in an impressive Dolphins win. Turns out he was AFC Offensive Player of the Week. But we got to ask the question, was it just a flash in the pan? He's got the Bills this week, so let's mine for some fool's gold here. Josh, are you in or out on Jay Ajayi?
Not just because you're a Bills fan, Sebastian, but I am going to bench Jay Ajayi this week. I'm kind of out unless I just don't have any better options. I do think the volume is going to be there, which we love. But and if the Dolphins are going to run with anyone, it's going to be with Jay Ajayi because really he's their best running back. And I would even point to Arian Foster, who's still working back from an injury, as purely a receiving back. But as you mentioned, the Bills just allowing, 3.4 yards per carry. Jay Ajayi is absolutely not worth starting this week, Kay.
All right, another guy who had a monster week last week, Kenny Britt. 7 catches, 136 yards, his first 2 touchdowns of the year. Kay, is that the real deal from Kenny Britt?
The touchdowns probably won't be repeated as far as having 2 in a single game. But yes, he is the real deal because nobody's paying attention to the fact that he's been consistently effective all season long. He averages 82 yards a game. He's averaging 4 catches a game this season. So for him to not be owned, for him to be available on the waiver wire is absolutely ridiculous. He is the real deal. You should pick him up. And I'm okay with playing him against the Giants. He's clearly the #1 receiver in that offense.
All right, one more for Kay. And if we're talking about fool's gold, what about Golden Tate, one of your favorites? Finally busted out last week. I saw you were quick on Twitter to say first 100-yard game in 30 starts for him. Are you a believer now in Tate?
I mean, he was a buy low in week 2, so I'm not exactly patting myself on the back for it because he's been non-existent. But I will say this, they're finding ways to use him creatively. I have the pleasure of working with Nate Burleson for 3 hours every morning, a guy who knows Matthew Stafford very well. And he says, listen, when he starts to find his guy, he sticks with that guy. So Nate Burleson sort of convinced me to be worried about Marvitron's production as they are finding ways creatively to get your boy Golden Tate involved. They've got a middling Washington pass defense this week, so I like him.
Josh and Kay killing it. Thanks, guys. We will have much more from both of them in just a little bit. But time now for our cheat sheet, where we hear from insiders across the NFL. And we'll start this week in New England, where Tom Brady is back, which has been great if you're Rob Gronkowski. It hasn't helped Julian Edelman, who's basically been invisible since Brady's return. With more on Edelman's role moving forward, here's CSN New England's Tommy Curran.
Well, everybody knows Julian Edelman can be one of the most productive wide receivers in the NFL, but the New England Patriots have an embarrassment of offensive riches, and that's why sometimes you'll see Edelman end up with 6 targets, 4 catches, and about 40 yards, and he goes up in a puff of smoke in your fantasy league if you decided to start him. When will it be Julian Edelman's turn? You're going to have to figure that out for yourself looking at matchups. Who's going to take away the tight ends? Who's going to take away the running game? Who's got that quick rush and sticky corners that makes it likely for the Patriots to check down to Edelman? Figure that out, and you got yourselves a winner when you go to number 11.
All right, let's turn our attention to the Redskins. Yes, the same Redskins who at one point couldn't run their way out of a paper bag. Well, they ran for 230 yards Sunday against the Eagles. Matt Jones had a huge day, but he wasn't alone. Rookie Robert Kelly looked real good as well. In fact, Kelly went from being owned in 1% of leagues all the way up to 10% this week. So, is he worth adding to your team? CSN Mid-Atlantic's JP Finley has that answer.
This time last week, Redskins running back Robert Kelly was popping up all over fantasy waiver wires. Kelly made sense then. Jay Gruden hinted he would get more carries, and Matt Jones had a disappointing performance against the Baltimore Ravens. 1 week later, Kelly impressed in his limited carries, including busting one very long run. But Matt Jones cemented his starting job. 16 carries, 135 yards, and a touchdown. Kelly will still get carries, but it's to supplement Jones, not to compete with Jones. If you're looking for a Redskin you might be able to pick up cheap, think about Pierre Garçon. He had 11 targets against the Eagles and has steadily gotten a lot of action over the middle and is developing a really strong trust with Kirk Cousins.
Okay, so Washington may be on their way to running back by committee. Cincinnati is already there. Jeremy Hill and Gio Bernard continue to split touches, and whichever one is in your lineup is almost guaranteed to do nothing. Derek Forrest of NBC5 Cincinnati tries to sort out the mess.
These two backs have played for the Bengals for the past 3 seasons, with Jeremy Hill getting 1,900 yards on the ground. Gio Bernard has 1,400 yards on the ground, but he also has 821 reception yards, kind of like James White of the New England Patriots, more of a flex back on your fantasy football roster. So the answer to your question is pretty simple on the surface. Jeremy Hill will get the majority of the carries by the end of the season, but you have to dig a little bit deeper to really see the true numbers.
All right, sounds like Jeremy Hill is the smart play long term. Thanks to all our insiders. Next up, we head to Facebook to take your questions live. Proposed trades, who to start, and who to sit. Our experts are back to answer all of your fantasy questions. Plus, the Texans offense has a lot of interesting pieces, but Kay Adams thinks some of them need to be on your bench as Houston heads to Denver. We'll tell you which ones when Real Fantasy continues here on CSN. Welcome back to Real Fantasy. You know, we try a lot of different ways to help you here on the show, but there is none more direct than our Facebook Live sessions. Every Thursday at 2:45 p.m. Eastern, Kay Adams, Josh Norris, and I will take all your fantasy questions live on Facebook at your local CSN page. It's a great way to get those tough questions answered straight from our experts. And here are some of the best questions from this week. Guys, as the questions roll in on Facebook, I have one for you. For my DFS lineups, I kind of like to look for matchups where I think there will be a lot of points across the board. Cleveland and Cincinnati was one that jumped out to me this week. Josh, give me another where we might find some fantasy points this weekend.
Well, I think you have to start almost everyone in that San Diego-Atlanta game. I will say this, the Atlanta defense is playing better of the last 3 weeks. They're allowing fewer rushing yards, so Melvin Gordon might not be as big of a play as other people think. But, yeah, on that San Diego defense, you're obviously starting Phillip Rivers. Hunter Henry's a top 12 tight end, obviously. In Atlanta, both those running backs are must-starts. Julio Jones, along with a few other names. A
lot of quarterback issues. Wesley wants to know, should I start Rivers over Breeze? Kay, what do you think?
Rivers over Breeze. I mean, you can do that. I don't know if you have both of those guys, you should probably deal one of them.
Look,
if I have
we start
Breeze,
off, the first question is Kay wanting to deal and wheel every single week.
I just don't understand why on any roster, when there's so many injuries and so much turnover and bench spots are such a premium, it's valuable real estate to have a guy like Wendell Smallwood on your bench. I'd rather have that and value and depth than to use a spot on a headache every week where you're tuning into Facebook Live, and we love having you, but you're tuning in to have us pick which guy to play when we don't know both of them are going to put up yards. Both of them with great matchups. Drew Brees on the road is a bit scarier, so I understand playing Phillip Rivers. It's just hard for me to sit Brees.
I know you're not super high on Kirk Cousins, but Sean wants to know Cousins or Marcus Mariota. Where are you going, Josh?
Oh, man. Well, you're asking a guy you're asking the guy who has loved Marcus Mariota since college. But I don't think that I love that offense. I know he's played better in recent weeks, and he's actually better on the road than he is at home. They're at home this week against Indianapolis Colts. I will go with Kirk Cousins and appease my CSN Mid-Atlantic fans out there.
But Dewan wants to know about Julio Jones. Okay, what's his trade value right now?
What's his trade value? Oh, I mean, it depends on your league and who you have and what you're comfortable giving up at the wide receiver spot. I think this week he's the #1 ranked wide receiver. So if you want to deal him, go ahead and do that. He's had some up and down situations. I cannot see. I'm not a trade gal. Like when I do my draft and I have Julio Jones and it's not an injured guy, I never deal them away, Josh. I'm a ride or die kind of gal.
Except when you have two quarterbats that you like. And
I would never draft two quarterbacks or be in that situation. But had I drafted a Russell Wilson and then I had Matt Ryan or Eli Manning as my right. Well, I'll use Matt Ryan since he's been so great. Then that's a gold mine to sell. It's not to keep both of them.
I don't know like what you can get for Julio Jones in terms of what would equal the value, because we have to get to the point, and it's absolutely true that this Falcons offense is for real, and he is the most talented player on that Falcons offense. And even in a difficult matchup last week against Seattle, he played really well.
Josh, Kay, we got to wrap it there. Great stuff to our friends on Facebook. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your questions
Thanks,
they
guys.
drove the conversation. Time for us to take a break. On the other side, we dive into the world of daily lineups. Josh spending big bucks at receiver. How much, you ask? Well, T.Y. Hilton is his cheapest option, and T.Y. Hilton ain't cheap. Real Fantasy continues in just a moment on CSN. Welcome back to Real Fantasy here on CSN. I'm Sebastian Salazar, and it is time now for our Fantasy Formula, where we delve into your daily games. And as you look at the Week 7 schedule, there are some big names you might want to stay away from this week, either injuries or maybe some bad matchups. So we'll get into all that in just a minute. But first, let's check out last week's results. And surprise, surprise, they were not even close. It was all Norris all the time. Josh going with LaShawn McCoy, by far his best player. Also got some pretty good performances from Cam Newton, Amari Cooper, and Cameron Meredith. Kay Adams had a good week, finally. And look at that. It probably would have won if not for the Norris Express. Kay relying on Terrence West and Dak Prescott. Smart pickup there for most of her points. And then there was the third team in said competition, and that guy doesn't know what he's doing clearly. Yeah, it was me. I only had 3 players scoring double figures. Basically, my team was a what not to do in daily fantasy. As we've discussed, guys, we don't like Ryan Matthews on his show. How bad was it? I started Ryan Matthews last week. I've learned my lesson now. Josh, it took you more than a month to win. Now you've won 2 in a row, so I'll give you a little gloating time.
Yeah, and this train is not stopping. Last week, Sebastian, I introduced you to my first friend, and this week we have another companion. Friend number 2. Now it's a 5-person panel. Hopefully you guys can catch up at some point because I'm just taking away this thing.
Yeah. 3 wins for me, buddy. 3. Who's catching up to who? All right, let's take a look at Josh's team for Week 7. A.J. Green, Mike Evans, and T.Y. Hilton at wideout. Lots of money invested there. So he saved some dollars by taking Alex Smith against the Saints and Jaquiz Rodgers against the 49ers. Rodgers really the only healthy running back remaining for Tampa. How about Team Adams? He's also going big at wide receiver. Julio Jones is the most expensive player on FanDuel this week, but we know Kay also loves to shop for deals. James White with Jaquiz Rodgers in her backfield and Hunter Henry at tight end. And since I can't do much worse than last week, we're hoping for a turnaround. I know Josh thinks Kirk Cousins not good at football, but neither is Detroit's defense. I like Cousins and Jamison Crowder to exploit the Lions D. And if I've learned anything from Kay, and I do listen, it's death, taxes, and start your players against the Saints. So Spencer Ware gets the nod in my backfield. All right, guys, so let's get into this. Josh, you spent big money on your wide receivers.
Right.
And I can't argue with your selections, but what made you decide this week to put a lot of money on that position? Because as I'm looking at it, a couple of your guys, Mike Evans and T.Y. Hilton, don't exactly have the most favorable matchups.
Oh, I would disagree. One, this is very opposite than what I did last week, right? I paid up for running back last week. I would say that these 3 receivers have some of the best matchups of the week. Obviously, the Cleveland Browns have allowed 4 top 12 wide receivers all season long. The Tennessee Titans, who T.Y. Hilton's going up against, have allowed 3. And most importantly, Sebastian, these are 3 of the top 4 target getters across the NFL. I'm very happy with these 3 as my wide receivers this week.
All right, Kay, let's look at your team. You love a good deal. Seems like you got 2 of them at running back with James White and Jaquiz Rodgers. What do you like about those 2 guys this week?
You know, Sebastian, I never spend on guys, so I'm also trying something new this week. I like to do the all bargain squad, but I spent big at wide receiver, really hit the bargain basement at the running back spot. I'm liking James White because over the past 2 weeks, he's only Edelman and Gronk have more targets than him. He's getting a ton of love in the backfield. Deion Lewis isn't back quite yet, and the Steelers have allowed 2 running backs to have 100-yard receiving games so far this year, so I really like the matchup in this one against Pittsburgh. And as far as the other guys concerned, Jaquiz Rodgers, listen, Doug Martin, if he doesn't suit up, Jaquiz Rodgers had over 30 touches last week. That's incredible. The Niners have allowed 7 touchdowns in the past 3 games to the running back spot. They're allowing over close to 200 rushing yards a game. It's a perfect matchup for Rodgers to go off and a great price tag.
All right, on my team, I knew I was going to start a Chiefs running back against the Saints. I wasn't sure which one. I ended up going with Spencer Ware, a little more expensive than Jamal Charles. But Charles was back last week, didn't get a lot of action in the Chiefs' win. I love the matchup with New Orleans, but Kay, is Ware a safe play with Charles still kind of lurking, hanging around? We know he's got the potential.
I think he's got the potential, and he has a role in this offense, even when Jamal Charles is as close to 100% as he's ever going to be. I think them dealing Niall Davis is almost a vote of confidence in Spencer Ware. He's still involved at the goal line, and he'll have a role and get touches, maybe half of them. Why give Jamal Charles all of the workload? You don't have to. You have a very viable, productive back, a younger back, to share the workload with.
And Sebastian, we know that Alex Smith can be captain check down at times, and Spencer Ware is an outstanding receiving back. But I'll say this, The Saints have allowed 11 rushing touchdowns so far this season. That leads the NFL. I wouldn't be surprised if both Ware and Charles are top 24 plays at running back this week.
All right, so I couldn't have gone wrong with either pick is what you're telling me. Our experts have helped you with your season-long and daily lineups. Now let's get some Week 7 predictions in this week's Crystal Ball. All right, Week 7 going to be a tough week to find good tight end options. You got Greg Olsen and the Panthers. They're off. Olsen's been the #1 tight end in fantasy this season. Jason Witten in Dallas also on the bye, so 2 starting options are gone. And there are injury concerns in Washington with Jordan Reed and Indianapolis with Dwayne Allen. All right, guys, for Olsen owners, or really anybody looking for an injury replacement at tight end, Kay, can you find us a good stream option at that position?
How about a guy who has 5 touchdowns in 6 games? His name's Hunter Henry, and he's owned in like a 25% of leagues. It's unbelievable. Go pick him up. He's got the Falcons that give up the 4th most points to opposing tight ends. Yes, Antonio Gates is back. It is not cutting into his workload. He's a thing, and he's staying.
All right, Josh, I don't usually think of running back as a streaming position. Could be why I'm too informed in my league. But who you got your eye on there?
Well, I asked for this one. It's Chris Ivory of the Jaguars going against the Oakland Raiders. I'll start with the lead. I think Chris Ivory can be a top 12 scorer at running back this week. Obviously, the Oakland Raiders defense is 1, terrible, and 2, allowing 125 yards rushing on average, along with 5 red zone attempts per game for the opposing team. I think Chris Ivory can have a great week because he also has that goal line work. We know that Greg Olsen wants to run the ball more in this offense.
Josh, you hammer this home all the time. So much of fantasy is matchup dependent. So give me a typical fantasy stud who has a tough matchup in Week 7 and could struggle. Josh, go ahead and start us off.
Yeah, especially coming off last week's game against the Carolina Panthers where he put up a ton of points. Brandon Cooks against the Kansas City Chiefs. We know Drew Brees' home road splits are really bad on the road. It's even worse for Brandon Cooks. Only 4 touchdowns in 15 road games. He only averages about 4 receptions for 52 yards in those performances. In every single situation, I'm benching Brandon Cooks on the road. And I'll say this, I think Michael Thomas's teammate will outscore Brandon Cooks this week.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. How about DeAndre Hopkins? Can we call him a stud anymore? I don't really know. He's only had 1 100-yard game this season. The targets are way down. And you gave me this stat before the show, Josh. I'm going to share it with the world now. 372 fewer yards this year through 6 games than last year. 372 yards. That is absolutely staggering. And the matchup, speaking of matchups, is up against Denver. No thanks. They've only allowed 1 wide receiver to be a 20-point fantasy scorer in any given week. Stay away.
Josh, Kay, thanks for your time. I'd say good luck, but you know I don't mean it. I want to beat you guys.
Thanks, guys.
All right, that's it for us here on Real Fantasy. Don't forget to join us every Thursday around 2:45 in the afternoon for Facebook Live. We'll get your questions into the experts. For those experts, Kay Adams and Josh Norris, I'm Sebastian Salazar. Thanks for watching, and good luck this weekend.